great interest, though, is our topic this evening. And retreat and its consequences, American foreign policy, and the problem of world order. All of those huge notions are absolutely fundamental and very much debatable today. So the presentation couldn't be any more timely, nor could be any more important to us. Our guest, as you know, is a professor at Georgetown, both in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service. He is the author of 12.5 books, or author or editor, the vast majority of them focusing on American foreign policy. It's fun to look at his bio if you enjoy that kind of thing, because it suggests an interest in basic international relations theory, the principles of American foreign policy, and then a serious treatment of the foreign policies of the United States over the past several decades. So it's from the kind of interest that most people in this room have, it's a very, very interesting bio, I believe. His career has been marked by what I think are interesting sets of recognition in almost any of the standard areas that you look at. He's been a visiting scholar. He's been a visiting professor. He certainly has been interviewed by major news organizations. He's advised political parties. He's advised the State Department. He's worked on not worked on, but advised those who create national security estimates. But he's done this, had these kind of experiences and recognitions and requests of him around the world. He's been a visiting professor in Shanghai, and he's written extensively for major European journals, several of the European countries. He's been interviewed and written in journals in the Middle East, and especially Israel, but Al Jazeera and others as well. And what it shows in general is and of course he's been at major American think tanks as well, it shows a pattern of deep recognition of his scholarship, and it's a recognition that really is international. So our guest is truly a highly regarded international scholar, and I would assert that he's one of the most serious students of American foreign policy, one of the nation's foremost. But in looking at his bio, I couldn't resist to note that he's from Chicago, and the Cubs won the World Series, and it's been noted that I talked to him about this, that he indeed has been a Cubs fan, but he's not old enough, and a lot of people remark it's been 110 years since the Cubs won a World Series. But he's not quite old enough to remember that it was over 70 years ago when the Cubs got to the 7th game of the World Series and lost to the Tigers with Hal Newhouser pitching. And the number of people in this room who remember Hal Newhouser probably are about 2. But anyway, he was a great pitcher. And the other tidbit that catches your attention in his resume, that he was a walk-on in North by Northwest. And he said that his students rent the film to see if they can find it. And he's also an avid tennis player. Now, which interests me as well. So there are small things within his bio which I think are fascinating, but the serious thing is that he's one of our nation's finest scholars on international affairs. The topic of tonight is splendid. It's an enormous privilege to present Professor Lieber.
Thank you, Frank. I especially appreciate the very generous introduction, and I appreciate the size of the crowd who are here for this. You never know when you show up whether you're going to have a crowd of 3 or 300. So it's a testimony to what you've done here with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Relations. I'll also add that I look forward to your questions and comments. It was mentioned that I'm from Chicago. I was born and raised there. And we Chicagoans have an earthy and direct sensibility. So when the question period comes, don't hesitate to ask me a direct, even impolite question. Unlike some of my more sensitive East Coast colleagues, you need not fear that you might hurt my feelings. So I'll speak for perhaps 25, 30 minutes, and I very much welcome your questions. I think that I value that interaction and so on. I will also shamelessly flog my book, which is the title of tonight's talk, Retreat and Its Consequences, American Foreign Policy and the Problem of World Order. It's a paperback from Cambridge University Press, available in e-reader, hardback, and paperback on Amazon. Makes a great gift. Also, we gather here this evening in an unusually volatile and uncertain time. The debates about foreign policy often go through phases. There's a period of uncertainty and churning and whatnot, and then things crystallize, and you have debates about the strategy or the doctrine or the type of policy choices being made, the rights and wrongs of a particular event or intervention or non-intervention. But these circumstances are relatively rare. One can think of the 18 to 24 months after the end of World War II, when there was great uncertainty after the end of World War II. There were expectations that the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, this was Roosevelt's expectation, would be the world's three policemen and work through the UN, and we would get along with the Russians. Well, that didn't happen, and the key ideas of foreign policy really only fell into place in the spring of 1947 with the doctrine of containment, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan, which followed. And then you have a period of 42, 44 years or so until the Soviet Union breaks up, where containment and the Cold War defined policy. Then we had a period of ferment after the end of the Cold War, and another one after 9/11. For whatever reason, in this case, especially because of the amazingly unpredicted and surprise results of the presidential election, and the uncertainty where President Trump and his administration are going to go on foreign policy, we're once more in a very volatile period. From where I sit as an author and scholar and teacher, there's a very rich and lively debate among policymakers, policy experts, academics, journalists, op-ed columnists about what the U.S. ought to be doing, what it has done in the past, where it should go in the future, and what in the world the Trump foreign policy is going to be about. And so I want to say some things which are mainly backward-looking, but then toward the end of my remarks, focus in on some speculation about the Trump foreign policy. I also would justify the attention, especially to the past 8 years, on the grounds that you have to know where you've been to have some sense about where you're going and what you think about that direction. Let me begin with a quote from my book, a paragraph about how I conceive of what the U.S. role has been, really since the end of World War II, or at least since the late 1940s, with an element of policy continuity that, in retrospect, was typical of most administrations, Republican and Democratic. As you'll see in a minute, I argue that the Obama administration pulled away from that with policies of retrenchment and retreat. But let me first set out the argument, but also know that it's contested. It's contested by realist theorists, it's contested by isolationists, and by those who think that we should just sit here behind our two oceans and be offshore balancers. It's a modern replay of the arguments of the 1920s and 30s, which is why the phrase America first has troubling nuances and echoes because of what America first represented, both on the surface and under the surface. I'll come back to that. So, just a passage from the first paragraph of chapter 5 of my book. For more than 7 decades, the international role of the United States has included, inter alia, creating and sustaining international institutions, supporting regional stability, providing deterrence and reassurance for allies, opposing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, underpinning the global economy, promoting trade liberalization and economic development, environmental protection, and often, but not always, encouraging human rights and democratization. In that unique capacity, and I want to emphasize the word unique, it effectively served not only as the leader, defender, and promoter of the liberal democracies and market economies, but also of the rules and norms of the existing international order, the durability of which so many take for granted. Now, my concern is that the Obama administration came to office. The president was sometimes criticized for supposedly not having an idea what he was doing, being too green, no real foreign policy experience, and so forth. But in fact, I would argue he had a very coherent, focused, deliberate set of policies and even a doctrine, one might call it the Obama Doctrine, which guided his conduct of foreign policy. I happen to think and argue, indeed I wrote a book about it, which I would urge you all to buy, that although well-intended, the consequences of that doctrine were unhelpful. They were unhelpful to world order. They tended to undermine it. And they were also unhelpful to our own national security interest. I would argue that Obama came to office with, in his mind, the reductio ad Iracum, by which I mean that in January 2009, when he took office, at that point, almost 6 years after the start of the Iraq War, he had concluded, as had the majority of the American public, that the war was a mistake, whatever the arguments for or against it at the time. And I would remind you that at the time that George W. Bush took the fateful decision to have the U.S. take military action to oust the loathsome regime of Saddam Hussein, about 60-some-odd% of the American public supported it, as did many public figures. And in the U.S. Senate, the Democrats in the Senate voted for it by a margin of something like 29-22, including every Democrat who expected to run for president in 2004. There was a vote in late 2002. That included Hillary, it included Joe Biden, it included Harry Reid, and it included, did I mention Joe Biden already? Yeah, Biden, and one or two others. John Kerry. So many of those in prominent positions in during the Obama administration had, in fact, supported the Iraq War at the start. Although, as John Kennedy once said about the Bay of Pigs fiasco, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. We weren't defeated in Iraq, but the costs of Iraq in every way, blood, sweat, tears, money, lives, legitimacy, geopolitics, have proved to be greater than the hoped-for benefits of that action. So I think Obama came to office in which the Iraq War and the problems of it symbolized in his mind what was wrong with American foreign policy. We were too present in the world, we were too engaged, we were too prone to intervene, we relied too much in his judgment on military force, and he had a recipe which was that we should do a whole series of things to pull back. He wanted to reach out to our adversaries, offer an extended hand, show them we meant no harm, offer a reset with Russia, reach out to the Ayatollahs in Iran and to China, and at the same time to put some distance between the U.S. and its allies. His administration spoke openly about putting some daylight between the U.S. and Israel, a point that Dennis Ross, for example, has argued had exactly the opposite effects from what Obama had wanted, but also showing a certain amount of arm's length attitudes and indifference at first to our allies. Obama never really established any rapport with a major European leader. The closest was for a few years with the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan. It was another story altogether. Instead, there were efforts to reach out, and those efforts largely failed. They failed because they did not take into account the problem of what, and here, forgive me, I'll commit social science for a minute. I've just come from the International Studies Association convention downtown, where there are about 5,000 international relations specialists mixing it up. That view deprives actors of agency. In other words, the autonomy, the individual nature of these societies, their history, their ideology, their tradition, and the values, judgment, and preferences of their rulers, their individual leaders, their presidents, their prime ministers, their dictators, what have you. His assumption was that hostility toward the United States was a product in substantial amount, not exclusively, but substantially, of what we did. And if we were nice, things would change. Now, I'm in favor of good and effective diplomacy. You have to be. But diplomacy and showing that we weren't their enemies was not the recipe for how to deal with them. And I think the failed efforts to do so had adverse consequences. And it's here I want to pick up some claims that former Vice President Joe Biden made, writing in Foreign Affairs just before the end of the administration. In September, October 2016, Biden, or his speechwriters, produced quite a good essay in Foreign Affairs, quite readable, which basically heralded what the administration had achieved in foreign policy. It began with the statement, quote, "We are stronger and more secure today than when President Barack Obama took office in January 2009. Now, you don't have to be a Trumpian or an opponent of President Obama to disagree with that statement. I must say that the statement was met with disbelief by a wide swath of the foreign policy community. You can take it generally, you can take it specifically, but by and large, most observers at home and abroad who follow foreign policy seriously would not have shared that. Yes, there are exceptions, of course, and there were certainly those who wrote books and articles defending the administration, but it's quite a stretch. And even in the academic world, even those who had been more or less defenders or supporters were often critical of that assessment. The problem was that applying the Iraq analogy and diminishing the use of power and threats of power and so forth had the following consequence. I referred to diplomacy. And of course, power without diplomacy is blind. But diplomacy without power is impotent. It's the knowledge of combining the two that provides effectiveness. It helps to get your friends, allies, and adversaries to do what you want them to do, ideally without firing a shot, because they know you have credibility, you know you have power, you know how to use it, and so forth. And I think the administration conspicuously failed to join those two elements together the way they might have. Now, I know somebody's going to say in the Q&A period, well, what about drone warfare? What about the modest surge in Afghanistan and so on? And of course, those things took place. These kinds of questions we're talking about are not all black and white. They're matters of more or less. They're on continuums and so on, or should I say continua. But I think the problem is, as I mentioned it, and it was a serious one that I think undercut the kinds of things that the president had hoped to do. Another factor to keep in mind is that some of his actions had consequences that reverberated around the world. The Red Line fiasco in Syria which many of you, of course, will know about, had an echo in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, which was stunning. If any of you traveled at that time and spoke to people in those areas who followed foreign affairs or were in foreign policy or business positions, often the reaction was aghast. First of all, about the Red Line fiasco, just briefly, the president in 2012 had said that if Saddam Hussein, sorry, Freudian slip, if Assad of Syria used poison gas or even moved chemical weapons against the rebels, this would change everything, and it would cross a red line. Now, if you say this as president of the most powerful country in the world, it has a particular meaning. Either don't say it at all, if you think that it's implausible or you just don't want to get involved in that quagmire, as some would argue coherently, or if you're going to say it, you have to be prepared to back it up. What happened the following year in 2014, he said it in 2013, Assad used it in an outlying area of Damascus, killed about 1,000 people with poison gas, civilians. The initial reaction of Obama was, well, we'll do something about it, and then he backed away. I won't take you through all the ins and outs of it, but he backed away and it was clear we weren't going to enforce the red line. Now, again, a lot of people would say, well, just as well we didn't get involved there. What were you going to do? How effective? But the problem was he had made the statement. It had been widely cited and reported. And when he backed away from it, it sent a dramatic signal to the world. It disheartened our allies, and it emboldened our adversaries, the unsentimental and otherwise problematic leaders in the Kremlin, Putin, in China, Xi Jinping, and in Tehran were emboldened by it. They concluded that they could push the envelope. It allowed them to become much more risk averse. You can't prove it unless Putin's memoirs get leaked by WikiLeaks or published in the New York Times. But there's every reason to think that in 2014, when Putin decided to do Crimea and Ukraine, what happened in Syria was on his mind, that he probably calculated that there would be very little pushback from the United States. Xi Jinping, who had presided in China over policies and his predecessors of China's peaceful rise, but who had already begun to shift when the financial crisis hit in 2008, became far more aggressive in the South and East China Seas, with seizing these rocky atolls, these places covered at high tide, and building air bases and facilities on them, and making clear they were stepping into other people's territorial waters and flexing their muscles. One could say the same thing about the Iranians in different ways. I think all of those were a consequence, at least in substantial part, of Obama policy, and that they were unfortunate and dysfunctional. Now, if you think I'm being too harsh on Obama, fair enough. I said I'm from Chicago, I can take it. Then my rejoinder to you is, please go home and read, cover to cover, the April 2016 issue of The Atlantic, the long set of interviews by Jeffrey Goldberg, who was given several months of intimate personal contact with Obama. And it's single space, about 30 pages long. It is a stunning primary source document of what Obama believes. I would argue I'm not saying anything that he, in effect, isn't signaling in that. And it's made even more rudely by his Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, in a New York Times Sunday Magazine interview around May 15th, in which Rhodes talks about the foreign policy establishment as, quote, the Blob, as though there were complete unanimity among it. Obama himself treats the foreign policy establishment with contempt. Just read the interviews, and you'll see what I mean. This solipsistic notion that he knows, and that somehow the foreign policy establishment is all of one voice. I mean, in fact, this is a foreign policy establishment that has served Democratic and Republican presidents, conservatives, liberals, people across the spectrum, some who want to use force a lot and some who don't want to use it at all, and so forth. And the notion that it's one coherent entity, the blob, and we know better, is both condescending and I think very inappropriate. I'll also say there was another failing. The failing was to dichotomize the choices that America was making in foreign policy. In reality, in foreign policy, there is an enormous range of options for a president and his advisors when they face a foreign policy decision, especially involving a crisis, possibly one which has conflict in it or implies perhaps the use of military forces. The president almost always would frame it in such a way as we need to do what I'm saying and what we, the administration, want to do, or the alternative is another Iraq war, period. The reality is there is an enormous continuum from rhetoric, diplomatic persuasion, cultural things, information resources, intelligence, economics, trade, monetary policy, subtle geopolitical pressures, military pressures, arms aid to your friends or the beleaguered, covert efforts, limited force, special forces, and so on. Lots and lots of things before you go to send 200,000 U.S. men and women to fight a war. And all too often, the choices were framed, it's either this or it's war. Now, rarely, and tragically, sometimes those are the choices, but in most cases, they weren't. And I think it was unfortunate. And I don't think that foreign policy analysts are going to treat, over the long view, the record of his foreign policy all that well, although if the Trump administration drives us off a cliff, everyone will have warm and fuzzy thoughts about the Obama era. Let me make a few more points before I wrap up. Obama's core beliefs, as stated not only in his speeches and so on, but explicitly in the Atlantic magazine interviews of April 2016 with Jeffrey Goldberg, who had spent about 6 months with him on the plane and exercising and God knows what else. Obama had stated that the Middle East, and some of these are direct statements, some are paraphrases, is no longer terribly important to U.S. interests, that multilateralism is a good thing because it's a brake on U.S. power, that, as he put it, multilateralism regulates hubris, that the red line in Syria was his finest hour. He expresses, as I've said, hubris and contempt for the foreign policy establishment, and he makes, unfortunately, disparaging remarks about our allies, something that he and Trump during the campaign had in common, I might add. A few more examples, a few cases. In Iraq, which Obama and Biden described as stable when U.S. troops withdrew at the end of 2011, he gave a speech at Fort Bragg in the middle of the month making exactly that claim. The departure, rather than leave a few thousand, maybe 5, 10, 15,000 troops there or more, as military commanders desperately wanted, as did the Americans on the ground there, as a kind of token of America's involvement and as a source of reassurance to mitigate the security dilemma among the different factions and especially ethnic groups in Iraq, the U.S. pulled out lock, stock, and barrel. And that unleashed, it reopened the way to almost immediately brutal sectarian warfare, the breakdown of the armed forces, thanks to a dysfunctional prime minister who was no longer under our gaze, and the rise of the Islamic State, and intervention by Iran-backed militias, and eventually the reintroduction of about 5,500 American Special Forces, who are there now, making Obama the 4th president in a row to commit troops to Iraq, which is a great irony. As most of you won't know the name, but there's a terrific scholar, statesman, military official named Peter Mansour, who was the number 2 to General Petraeus during the surge in Iraq. He was a career military guy, a colonel, but who also got a Ph.D. and now runs the International Relations Program at Ohio State. Peter Mansour, who was, again, the executive officer, knew Iraq intimately, had fought there and so on, commented that by doing this, pulling out all the troops without leaving enough there for credibility purposes as a symbol of that America's there, but not to do a lot of fighting or anything like that, Mansour says it was the equivalent of spiking the ball on the 2-yard line, unquote. I think it's a lovely metaphor. I've already referred to Syria and the blow to our credibility. Also, when you make these decisions about in crisis and about whether to commit force or how to deal with a crisis are often very difficult decisions made with imperfect information, among great uncertainty, with immense time pressure, and without being able to have foreknowledge of the outcomes. These are hard judgment calls, but nonetheless, you have to be prepared to make those decisions, and it's important to say, well, not only what are the consequences of acting, but what are the consequences of inaction? And all this is deeply contested, and I have friends on both sides of this. I think there's a case to be made that when Hillary and I believe it was either Robert Gates or his successor and several other top officials of the Obama administration pressed Obama for the U.S. to take action in 2012, not combat troops, but perhaps use of air power, weapons, support for the rebels, and so on, at a time when it looked like Assad might fall. Obama made the decision not to go. Many of the things I've referred to, by the way, were decisions inside the administration where his senior foreign policy officials wanted to go one way and he went the other way. But you say, well, what are the consequences of not acting? And the consequences of not acting, in part, although in fairness you have to say, yeah, but what about events on the ground, have been half the population of Syria as refugees, internal or external, millions flooding out into the adjacent countries which have been destabilized, more than 1 million flooding into Europe, where they have helped to destabilize European politics and the European community and stimulated the rise of populist parties. Terrible death toll, probably at this point at least 500,000 dead. Pardon me? Well, yeah, that's all right. At least 500,000 Syrians dead, and Iran and Russia really being the big external players in that area right now. One last example, and then let me wrap up so we have time for questions. I know there are going to be people who disagree with me, but I can take it. Putin and Ukraine. In 2014, Putin first, using hybrid warfare, took over Crimea. And then shortly afterward, first supporting Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donbass region and other parts of eastern Ukraine, and then with the so-called Little Green Men, military figures in new uniforms without any markings, and then military vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces without markings, and then overtly, Putin intervened in eastern Ukraine. Now you can say, well, Brezhnev was drunk when he gave Crimea to Ukraine in 54, well, 56, whenever it was, as a birthday present, and so there was theirs to take back. Well, the problem with that is we have certain rules of the road for international order. The United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Agreements of 1975, which the Russians wanted dearly because they were desperate to get international legitimation of the border changes that were imposed on territories that had belonged to their eastern neighbors, and Poland and Germany, and they wanted, in effect, ratification of those borders, which they got at Helsinki in the Helsinki Declaration in August 1975. And there were a series of other East-West agreements in Europe. And finally, in 1994, the Ukrainians who had left the Soviet Union when it broke up with lots of nuclear weapons agreed to give all their weapons back to the Russians in exchange for something called the Budapest Memorandum, 1994. You can look it up. The U.S., Russia, and Britain and Ukraine signed it, and it guarantees, in exchange for giving this stuff back, it guarantees the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Now, you may not like the borders of Ukraine, but these are the things we do. What, you want to give back Arizona and California? I hear any hands raised for that? Oh, California, okay. The problem was that, and by the way, the Budapest Memorandum was signed later by China and France. So the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who are basically the world's ability to act internationally if the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 authorizes a war, for example, as it did just a couple of times only. All 5 of them were parties to that agreement. Well, what happens? Putin does this, and the leader of Ukraine picks up the phone, dials 911 to call the countries who signed this, and there's nobody at the other end of the phone. Basically, everybody more or less ducked. Yes, we put some economic sanctions on Russia. Yes, they hurt its economy, some. Yes, the Germans support the sanctions, some. But it hasn't really changed Russian behavior. But more importantly, it breaks what are the fundamental rules of international law, of the international order, in ways that suggest there are problems, not just there, but in other ways about how the world has operated in often peaceful and constructive ways since the end of World War II, what the basic understandings and rules of the road are. And the failure to basically support that agreement in any tangible way. For example, the Ukrainians right then desperately wanted defensive weapons. Night vision goggles, secure radios, body armor, and so on. The first impulse of the Obama administration was to give them 300,000 meals ready to eat, battlefield rations. Now, later on, we covertly did some things. The Europeans covertly did some things. But Obama's response was, well, what good would it do? Ukraine can't defeat the Russian army anyway. That's true, but it misses the point. If the Ukrainians, even under dire circumstances, have been able to inflict real pain on the Russians, on the militias, and so forth, and they're still fighting there, but the Ukrainians are doing rather better than you might have thought, even while suffering terrible casualties and with inferior armaments. But the ability to give the Ukrainians a better option for inflicting pain on the Russians, to make the campaign more costly, could, I think, have been a better deterrent to an action that was illegal, aggressive, and sets a very bad precedent. Finally, a couple of thoughts about so my argument is that for the 8 years of the Obama administration, we tended to follow a policy of retrenchment, disengagement, pulling back in different ways across different chessboards. Not all black and white. We stayed engaged in certain ways, but far less overtly than we had been before, and engagement does not mean primarily boots on the ground. Now, we come to Trump, and nobody knows what's going to happen. If Trump were to follow the kinds of statements he made during the campaign and some of his early tweets, it might mean he was actually doubling down on what Obama had done, disparaging NATO in this case, saying he doesn't care if the EU breaks up, saying it's a dandy thing that the Brits are withdrawing under Brexit. It doesn't mind if South Korea and Japan go nuclear. opposing trade agreements, and various other things. But we don't know. He has said things the opposite of some of those points, I think, of NATO. But the question is, who's going to be making policy? Will it be General Mattis and Secretary of State Tillerson and National Security Advisor McMaster? Or will it be the so-called Strategic Studies Group in the White House under Steve Bannon and a character named Sebastian Gorka and Jared Kushner? Gorka is fond of wearing a Hungarian-style costume which belonged to his father, and on it he bears a medal of a particularly odious Hungarian militia, which during World War II had an extremely unsavory record, if I might.
And a coat of arms.
And a coat of arms that. So who's going to call the shots? We don't know that. I think it's fair to say that Trump's impulses are Jacksonian. Here I'm using the categories of Walter Russell Mead, who wrote a terrific book called Special Providence, saying that presidents tended to have foreign policies that were Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, Wilsonian, or Jacksonian. Jacksonianism is an impulse. It's more nationalist. It believes in a strong America, having strong, powerful armed forces, but not being eager to engage abroad. But if our interests are threatened or we're attacked, responding with draconian use of force. Again, these are impulses, and it's just a guess. I suspect at this point, Trump himself may not know what he's going to do. The broader point, though, is that the things we take for granted, I'll go back to that statement I read at the beginning from my book, the nature of the international order, the assumptions on how the world works, really require the United States' role. The United States remains the world's principal provider of collective goods. There are collective action problems. How do you get countries to decide what to do? Think of if you've got 12 of you, if you have 2 of you going out to dinner and a movie, you have no trouble deciding. If there are 12 of you going out for a dinner and a movie, it's really hard. If there are 28 of you, forget it. Well, the EU has 28 countries. And it's hard to agree on anything. The fact of the U.S. being engaged, and by the U.S. role, I don't, again, mean the U.S. ordering the world around or solving all the world's problems, but being prudent and engaged where it matters. I'm talking about engagement rather than the use of force per se. But unless the U.S. is engaged, whether it's about trade, monetary affairs, culture, human rights, aggression, arms control, proliferation, or what have you, it's likely to be a more disorderly and dangerous world. And the Obama-era assumptions that if we pull back, the international community will, quote unquote, step up, unquote, is, I think, just not the way the world works. Let me stop at that time. I welcome your questions, and I think I'm going to ask you to pick out people to ask me questions, and so I'll try to keep my responses concise.
Well, we thank you for an absolutely clear presentation and a wonderful base for questions which may follow. Floor is open. The 2 questions are, to what extent does Saudi Arabia should it be held? To what extent should it be held responsible for the Syrian crisis? And then I think your second question was, to what extent should those who favored NATO expansion be blamed for the Ukrainian situation? And then a tag-on question was, isn't eastern Ukraine to a great extent Russian ethnically?
Those are great questions, but I'll try to be very concise so that others have a chance. The word retreat was simply, it's a matter of semantics. I was referring really to retrenchment and a tendency toward disengagement. And retreat really meant a pulling back, not a military retreat. Second, I would argue that the effect of Obama policies and his retrenchment over 8 years has been to help encourage or foster, at least permissively, the rise of hostile revisionist powers. The world of 2000, January 2009, did not really have us facing a hostile revisionist power And now we've got 3 or 4 to worry about. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and although in a different category, the North Koreans, who are developing missiles which sooner or later will be able to hit the United States, although it'll take a while. About Syria, I think modesty for all of us is important. It's a catastrophic situation. About the only thing I can say is that if we were to do anything there, it had to be done early, when we might have made a difference. And I stress the word might. Colin Powell once in his memoir after he finished serving in government said something to the effect that decision-making occurs in situations where you have incomplete information. If you wait for all the information, it's too late. If you have too little information, you're not likely to make a good choice. But to the extent that anything could have been done, it in retrospect should have been done earlier. The later you go, the more awful the choices and the less likely you can produce anything other than terrible outcomes, terrible versus more terrible. On Ukraine and NATO, yeah, but there were proposals about absorbing Georgia and Ukraine, but those were quickly pulled back. They were not real. They were not live. They had no political possibility of ever happening, I would submit. And the Russians, using very skillfully disinformation, which they are really masters at, have ridden that theme very hard. It's a rationale for something they did, which was in fact quite aggressive as part of Putin's effort to reassert geopolitical control or domination or influence over as much of the former Soviet Union and its periphery as he can do.
Normally I would hold this question for later, but I want the larger audience to hear it and the TV audience as well. I want to probe a bit at this notion of retreat, a topic that Frank and I have discussed quite a bit, and that is, what is the role of the United States today, circa 2017? And I think too often we hark back to 1945, after the war, and we were the last man standing. We in the United States controlled nearly 40%, not quite, but almost 40% of world GDP. There was almost nothing we could not do if we wanted to do it. Today is not 1945. So what, in your view, what is the proper role for the United States of America in 1917? Oh, correct, 2017.
I used a slip like that. I was in a debate about my book, and I was debating two people who liked it, who didn't, and both people who were realists and therefore challenged it, made errors about dates, 1917 instead of 2017, which I used to question their overall argument. It's casuistry. You raise a good question. Clearly, the U.S. at the end of World War II was in a unique position, as we were at the end of the Cold War. But it's worth remembering the U.S. today has still, in fact, for the last 4 or 5 decades, has possessed about 20 to 25% of world GDP, particularly if you measure it in terms of purchasing power parity. And the U.S. has enormous power assets at home by all the things by which you measure national power: land area, population, education, research universities, the depth and breadth of our financial markets, the strength of the dollar, our energy resources, our agricultural resources, our natural resources, our productive capacity, the adaptability of our society, and so forth. So we still have a greater national strengths or power than any country in the world, even though there are rising powers: the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, India, the so-called third world countries are much more important players than they were. The European Union still is a crucial force in economics, trade, and so forth. But my argument is the U.S. needs to be prudent. Nonetheless, the U.S. plays, to quote Bill Clinton in his second inaugural, an indispensable role. I would argue that's still true. It doesn't mean you go around like a gunslinger invading everywhere you want or trying to solve every single problem. You have to decide on priorities. You have to decide what's really important, and there are some issues you need to duck. But that still is essential for our national interests and our values, and I think too many people tend to disparage that or disavow that need without reckoning the consequences of backing away too overtly. And by the way, I wrote a book on that too, 2012. It's an anti-declinist book called Power and Willpower, with lots of data.
We'll follow up later.
Good.
Would you comment about some of the solutions that you think are most important?
Well, I signed one of the Never Trump letters, so if I tried to set foot in the White House, I'd be shot. My advice, first of all, modesty is important. These are difficult, complex issues, often with imperfect information, and some of them do not have good solutions. I think of the Syria case right now, although awesomely bad consequences, whatever takes place. I would advise him to listen first and foremost to his 3 senior foreign policy officials, the heads of the State Department, NSC, and National Security Council. That would be my advice in a nutshell.
How do you get your message, carefully thought through message, to the general American public? And parenthetically, years ago, the attentive public was identified as about 6% of the American population. And especially if you believe that some of your congressmen don't fully understand the matters either. What's the problem of education?
There's an old saying about public speaking that you should never underestimate the public's intelligence, your audience intelligence, nor overestimate their information. And I think leadership by an administration can and should involve the president and those around him speaking frankly and honestly and persuasively to the public. I think there have been failures on that. The TPP is one such failure. The Trans-Pacific Partnership with PP, whatever it stands for, was a win-win proposition. It was terrific in economic and trade terms. It had all the safeguards and features that were missing from NAFTA. It would have benefited us and those other countries, and it had a major geopolitical upside. And it's not only Trump who's disavowed it formally, but Hillary and Bernie Sanders disavowed it also during the campaign. Hillary had previously supported it, and the Obama administration, President Obama, never really went to bat for it. He didn't use the bully pulpit. So I think you can talk to quote unquote ordinary people and recognize that they're not stupid. You should not underestimate their intelligence or savvy, but that you need to provide information and make a coherent argument about how something relates to the country and them. I do think that often impulses in foreign policy do tend to be rather Jacksonian, in just terms of the man or woman in the street. I think of sometimes discussing things with my aunts and uncles years ago. But nonetheless, leaders have to do that, and it can make a difference. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, the American public, A, could not have found Kuwait on a map, and B, were opposed to the idea of our taking military action to liberate Kuwait. George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, made the case. He made it at the UN. He and Margaret Thatcher made it. He made it with the House and Senate, barely. He just passed the Senate by about 5 votes. And he made it with the American public. So by the time the war started, he had a majority of the public on his side. That's what leadership is about.
Would you comment upon today's role of the UN in reshaping the world order or getting a hold of it?
If the UN didn't exist, we would have to create it. The hope of Roosevelt and others in creating the UN was looking back at the 1930s and 20s and the failures of the League of Nations to try to build an international institution in which the 3 great powers of the day, which became the Big Five because of the size of China and because of General de Gaulle made himself such a nuisance, it was better to have him inside the tent than outside it, doing you-know-what. But the ability of the UN to act is really the Security Council. The UN Charter and Chapter 7 gives the Council really considerable authority if the 5 members can agree, and if they can't, the importance of the veto is such. The original idea is these are such great powers that if you can't force one of the 3, in this case 5, to do something if they're unwilling to do it. There are rare occasions where you get a consensus. The decision to UN Resolution 678, passed in late 1990, was one of those rare occasions. The Cold War was ending. Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and the Soviet, I should say, well, still Soviet leader, Gorbachev, were on great terms with Bush and Baker, and they got a UN resolution essentially authorizing the use of force if Saddam did not withdraw from Kuwait. That was almost unique. There was an agreement on Libya, which was not quite what it was exploited to be, but which was that the member countries were supposed to protect civilians, create a no-fly zone, and so forth. And led by the British and French, and supported by us, and the United Arab Emirates and some of the Qatar, Kuwait, and so on, other countries drove a loophole through that to bring down Gaddafi. The Russians and Chinese think they were diddled and will be extremely reluctant to support further action under R2P, Responsibility to Protect, which was passed in a UN resolution in the middle of the last decade. So the UN has certain capacities. It's useful that countries talk, but it has certain limitations. It is hugely bureaucratized. It spends much too much money. There's a lot of corruption there, particularly orchestrated by Russians, Iranians, and Cubans in terms of offices and contracts and so forth. The use of the Human Rights Commission, a council I should say, is a scandal directed ridiculously at Israel while ignoring far more grievous problems and issues around the world. And the makeup of the Human Rights Council continues to contain some of the most notorious and appalling human rights abusers in the world. So the UN's a mixed bag. It's specialized agencies, World Health Organization, do important things that nobody else could do, but it's got real limits. And clearly, President Trump is a skeptic about it. The initial action of our UN ambassador, Haley, is impressive. It makes me think of Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Jeane Kirkpatrick, which from my standpoint is high praise.
Having watched a lot of British television, I must say it was an absolutely brilliant evening. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.